Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce the next session, which is called Understanding Basic Transplant Lab Values. Please ask your questions in the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, and our presenter will be answering those live today. We're delighted to have her. My name is Sara, and my daughter had a kidney and liver transplant, and I volunteer for transplant families. I'm very honored to welcome Dr. Sara Dong, who is a combined adult and pediatric infectious disease physician at Emory University, the School of Medicine, and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where her clinical focus is on infections in transplant recipients and immunocompromised patients. Thank you very much for tuning in, and here is Dr. Dong. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sara Dong. I am an adult and pediatric transplant infectious disease doctor in Atlanta. Today we're going to learn a little bit more about understanding transplant lab values. We know it can be a lot to go through the lab experience, especially as a child. Why are we drawing so much blood? What are we looking for with these test results? In general, these labs are looking at overall health and body systems, the function of your organ transplant, components of cells in the blood, and sometimes amounts of medication or microorganisms in the bloodstream. All of the tests that we're going to focus on today are going to be blood tests, meaning they are from a blood draw or blood work where the sample is drawn from usually a vein in the upper arm, but then sometimes it's drawn from a catheter that's already in place, especially if you're in the hospital. They are commonly collected in tubes like this, which you'll likely recognize. There are a variety of different colored tops because the different tubes are used for different tests. Today, I've made us a little electronic health record navigator here to talk through some of these important lab results with the labels that you might see when you click on them in something like your MyChart. So let's start with the CBC or complete blood count. Sometimes people will say full blood count. A CBC with or without a differential is used to really look at overall health and to follow a wide range of conditions that might include anemia or infection. A CBC can also show unusual increases or decreases in cell counts, and those changes might suggest to us as your medical team to think about a side effect of a medication, infection, or a new medical condition that might call for more testing. And before we get into the specifics of a CBC, I actually think it's quite helpful to quickly talk about the components of blood and their importance. Here I've made a representative sample of blood that has been divided into the four main components: plasma, white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. You can see that blood is predominantly made from plasma here in the yellow and the red blood cells here in the red, with a much smaller proportion being white blood cells and platelets. If we look a little bit closer, these sections are made of further ingredients. The plasma is the liquid component of blood, which is a mixture of water, sugar, fat, protein, and electrolytes or salts. This plasma fluid helps transport the blood cells throughout the body, along with other things like those nutrients I mentioned, waste products, other items like chemical messengers such as hormones. The next largest proportion is the red blood cells here on the bottom. Sometimes you'll hear the term erythrocytes or RBCs. Red blood cells look like these little discs that actually have indentations, almost like a donut, but there's not really a hole in the center. Red blood cells contain a special protein called hemoglobin that helps carry oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body and then returns carbon dioxide from the body to the lungs so it can be exhaled. Hemoglobin actually is what gives these cells their red color. And in some ways, I think you can think of the red blood cell system as kind of like a mailing system, helping to ship oxygen throughout the body. Next, we'll take a closer look at white blood cells here, and these are much less common in number than red blood cells. You may also hear the word leukocytes for white blood cells. These help protect the body from infection and other diseases as part of your immune or defense system. There are 5 major types of white blood cells that I've listed here on the slide. Really, the most common type is one called a neutrophil, which is what we call an immediate response cell. So it is usually the first one to be sent in the blood to an area where, for example, an infection might be. The other major type is a lymphocyte, and even within the lymphocytes, there's different subpopulations. So we're not going to go too far into the details for that, but just so that you know, there's lots of different types of white blood cells. And then lastly, I have a few small little dots here to represent platelets. And actually, platelets are not truly cells the way that red and white blood cells are, but they're rather small fragments, and they help with blood clotting as a process, which is also called coagulation. So they can gather at the site of an injury, they can line an injured blood vessel, and allow a clot to form. So back to our CBC, when you get the result, you're going to see multiple test names, and I put an example here on the right of how it might look. And so there are 4 major values that we're generally tracking. The first that is usually listed is WBC, or white blood cells. So this is measuring that total number of white blood cells that we talked about in your blood. Next, we have the hemoglobin and hematocrit. You can see the abbreviation sometimes people use here, HGB, HCT. The hemoglobin, again, is that oxygen-carrying protein in your red blood cells, so we can measure that. And then the hematocrit is a percentage or amount of red blood cells in the blood. And then lastly, out of those big 4, we have platelets, which help with blood clotting, but also can sort of act as a indirect measure of inflammation in the body. I will add that there are some other values that are reported on the CBC that we're not going to go into detail today. In general, these values help measure the size of red blood cells. So one example is something called the mean corpuscular volume, or MCV, which is a measure of the average size of a red blood cell. So as you may have guessed or are already aware, abnormal levels of red blood cells, hemoglobin, or hematocrit may be a sign of anemia or too little iron in your body. Changes in white blood cells can be a signal of infection or a reaction to a medication. There are times that we use a different version of this test called a CBC with differential. This includes the same information I just talked to you about, but includes something called a differential, which measures the number and percentage of each of those subtypes of white blood cell that I mentioned: neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. It may be that your percentages of these cells and the total numbers are in the normal range, but if they are abnormal, the pattern of how it is abnormal can help provide us some useful information as we think about what the cause might be. I'll give one example, which is that eosinophils often act as a signal of allergic reactions or side effects to medication, but it also can be elevated in something very specific like a parasitic infection. All right, so we're going to head back to our EMR here. And next, we're going to move on to the basic metabolic panel, or BMP. So this measures 8 different substances in your body related to chemical balance, electrolytes, metabolism. This is often used as a common blood test, again, to look at overall health and screen and monitor for certain health conditions. But really, it's kind of giving us a marker of your general nutritional status as well. I'll start with the labs in the BMP that are used to monitor your kidney function. Many of you are probably familiar with these. The first is BUN, or blood urea nitrogen. This is a measure of urea, which is a waste product that your kidneys help remove from the blood. And then creatinine, which is sometimes abbreviated with this big C little r, is also another byproduct. It's from muscle activity. And so this waste product is also filtered by your kidneys. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, if BUN and or creatinine are increased, this often is due to various kidney disorders or dysfunction, and sometimes from medications. So we'll move the BUN creatinine up here with these kidneys. And next, I'll point out the electrolytes. Electrolytes help with a lot of different things. They help with controlling nerve and muscle function. They also help to maintain the balance of the pH, or acid-base levels in the blood. They actually can even be involved in how water is balanced throughout your system. And so There's 5 major ones that are on the BMP. The sodium, or you may know of as salt, mostly comes from food that you eat, but your kidneys also help regulate your sodium. Potassium also comes from food often that you eat, and it's present throughout tissues in your body. Bicarbonate indicates the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. Chloride functions along with this sodium potassium bicarbonate to help control a lot of those processes in the body that I mentioned. And then calcium is an important and common mineral in your body that, many of us think about calcium that's stored in the bones, but you actually need calcium in your blood for proper functioning of nerves and heart and muscles. And then lastly, we have glucose. So glucose is a type of sugar that helps provide energy to your body and brain. You may have also heard of this as blood sugar. So I have a little sugar cube with a droplet of blood here. And so these are the lab values that you're going to get back under the BMP. But your transplant team may also order something called CMP instead of BMP to get a more complete picture and to specifically monitor your liver function. So again, CMP and BMP are routine blood tests. The difference for the CMP is that it includes all the tests from the BMP I just mentioned, plus another 6 tests. The first of these is total protein, which looks at a measurement of albumin and globulins, which are proteins that exist in the blood. The albumin is a specific protein that your liver makes that helps with a lot of transport of important substances, including medications through your bloodstream, and helps keep the fluid from leaking out of your blood vessels. Bilirubin is a biopigment in blood that is basically a waste product that's made when your red blood cells are broken down, and your liver is in charge of removing that bilirubin from the body. So if you do have an increase in the bilirubin, this might show an increased breakdown of red blood cells or liver dysfunction. And then lastly, we have 3 liver enzymes, or enzymes are substances that act as a catalyst to allow certain bodily processes to happen. So the main ones are alanine transaminase, aspartate aminotransferase, but these are very commonly referred to as ALT and AST. And then the other one here, alkaline phosphatase, you may also hear the term ALK-Phos. This is an enzyme that is present in primarily liver, bone, and the biliary tract. In children and adolescents, an elevated level might just reflect active bone growth. But in adults, for example, elevated levels may be more of an indication of liver, biliary tract, or bone problems. All right. And so in addition to the BMP and CMP, there are often a couple tests that might accompany these. So the first one that you may hear of in addition to your metabolic panels is GGT. This is the full name, gamma-glutamyl transpeptidase, but really no one says that. This enzyme is found in high levels in the liver, kidney, pancreas, and brain, and typically if it's going to be sent, it's sent with other liver testing, such as the ones I just showed you, ALT, AST, ALK-Phos, and bilirubin. This is often sent with those tests because it can help with detecting the difference between liver or bile duct disorders and bone disease based on the pattern if it is abnormal. And then a cystatin C is another test you might see, which represents a protein that's produced by cells in your body. Similar to the BUN or creatinine, if the level of cystatin C is elevated, this is a sign that your kidneys are not filtering or working as well as they could be. Usually, your healthcare providers are checking your kidney function or estimated glomerular filtration rate or GFR with a creatinine test, but sometimes they may prefer to use a cystatin C because it can be more sensitive to understanding your kidney function if your creatinine may not result as we normally would expect. So some examples of this might be extremes of age, if you have changes in your baseline muscle mass, or if your prior creatinine testing was not as accurate. And so one of the drawbacks for this is that it probably is generally going to take longer to result than a creatinine. I'll also mention two other electrolytes. The first of these is magnesium. So this is a mineral or electrolyte that, again, you can get from various foods, but it impacts your muscles, nerves, and heart. It actually also plays a role in blood pressure and blood sugar and building strong bones, but this is not collected as part of the regular metabolic panel. And then phosphorus is another electrolyte that helps with a lot of body processes, particularly bones and energy, and helping your nerves and muscles work properly. It often is in balance or connection to your levels of calcium, vitamin D, and another hormone that we're not really talking about much here called parathyroid hormone. But again, magnesium and phosphorus are very useful tests to give us information that complement what we learn from your metabolic panel. All right, and so I'm going to transition a little bit now to talk about some lab tests that are medication levels. So when your child or you take a medication by mouth, it's absorbed through the body. And then in some cases, we can measure that amount of drug in the bloodstream. And as you've probably discussed with your transplant team before, your transplant immunosuppression medications can help protect against rejection of your organ. So, lower levels of your immunosuppression medicines might make us more worried about the risk of rejection. On the other hand, higher levels can be worrisome for side effects or toxicity from the medicine, and ultimately can provide an increased risk for infection. And so medication level labs, when they're sent, help your transplant team ensure that you have the right amount of medication in your body at the right dose. And the goal is really to find that dose that's effective in protecting your transplant from rejection while also reducing the risk of side effects and infection. And so most patients are going to be on a medication called Tacrolimus, or you may use the other name Prograf. If you take Tacrolimus for your transplant, your team will follow the blood levels of this medication, which may show up in your record as the Tacrolimus or Prograf blood level monitoring or level. Typically, this lab is drawn 12 hours after your last dose of Tacrolimus to get what we call a trough, which is the lowest concentration in the blood. So for many people, this is going to be checking the lab in the morning. And so everyone's combination of immunosuppression and the doses are going to vary. That can be impacted by age, the underlying diseases you may have, the organ transplanted, how close you are to transplant, including other medical problems and or protocols at your transplant center. I do think that the most important take home here is that the dosages are tailored to each individual patient, even though there are some common ranges that we would use. So you can always talk to your transplant team about what is the target range or goal for your tacrolimus level, and they'll likely be talking about that at your appointments. I think one thing that's important to also keep in mind is that if for some reason the lab can't complete your blood work at the required time, or you've taken your medication, that's something you want to let your transplant team know, oh, my lab was actually drawn later or earlier than expected. So I put an example of what a tacrolimus level might look like when you pull it up in your electronic medical record. And you can see that they are probably going to provide some reference ranges. But again, these are sort of general rules of thumb. I would make sure that you talk to your transplant team to ask what your specific target ranges for your tacrolimus level or tacrolimus trough. And then similar to the tacrolimus level, you may occasionally see something called a mycophenolate level. This test instead measures the amount of mycophenolate or mycophenolic acid, MPA, which is the active metabolite of that drug in the blood. It is similarly drawn as what we call a trough level, with a blood sample taken just before your next dose when the drug is at its lowest concentration. I'd say this test is not done routinely in all people taking mycophenolate. Most patients are going to be placed on a standard dose, And we would be monitoring the drug levels indirectly by following the patient in clinic. If there was any concern that the dose was too high or too low, though, or maybe it has a interaction with another medicine, then your transplant team may check this level. So I just mentioned it, but the sort of idea behind the level would be very similar to what we talked about for the Tacrolimus. One last area that I'm just going to mention, we can't talk about in too much detail, but as an infectious disease doc, this is a lot of what we meet with patients about. Early after transplant in particular, you may see some what we call viral studies or viral testing for a couple key viruses. So I put 3 in particular here on the slide. EBV, which is Epstein-Barr virus, CMV, which is cytomegalovirus, and BK virus, which is also known as polyomavirus. Testing for these viruses measures the amount of virus DNA or genetic material circulating in the blood. You may hear the terms PCR test, viral load, or virus level. These are often reported as undetectable or with a number which represents the amount of virus found. Early on after transplant, you may see that these are checked routinely to make sure that they are normal. They also may be monitored or checked if you have new or ongoing symptoms that your transplant team thinks may be due to viral infection. And so this is a big topic that I didn't want us to spend too much time on, but important to understand the type of tests that we're checking. So I hope this was helpful. I know it's quite a whirlwind and doesn't cover comprehensively every lab that you're going to get sent, but I hope this is a good starter guide, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.